Hello, this is the second half of a two-part study on Cornwall and its relationship with England. If you haven't watched the first part already, I'd highly recommend doing so. Last time on the Embur channel, I spent some 11 minutes talking about the history of Cornwall and its relationship with England, and whether or not this little county could go from breaking free of English yoke and taking its place among its fellow Celtic nations on the world stage. As I expected, the conclusion we came to was a pretty firm probably not. At the end, I asked what I initially thought would be a pretty simple question to answer. Does Cornwall even have the necessary means to survive as its own country? I mean, of course not. But just how much does it not? Due to some rather strict time constraints, I didn't have the time to answer that question in the last video, and also it would have made the last video needlessly long. As it turns out, trying to study the geopolitical and socio-economic intricacies of a peninsula hundreds of miles away from anywhere you're familiar with isn't the easiest thing to do when you're pressed for time. With everything out of the way though, we can now delve into the nitty-gritty bits of it all, and find out if our favourite little budding peninsula even has the means to level itself up from a sleepy little county to a fully fledged nation-state. Let's get reading, shall we? This is the part in most videos like this where the narrator will begin to go on a spiel about how technically you don't need anything to be your own country, and that a country can simply exist by declaring itself to be. Then they'll start talking about Sealand and the various other little micronations that you find are really funny when you're 14, but the comedy is mostly waned as you've gotten older, perhaps because those doing the same thing at that age gives you an uncomfortable analogue into the kind of person you used to be, or maybe that's just me. I'm not going to do all of that. There's a handful of things that a country needs to kind of at least have to save them a page in the history books, rather than just as a little footnote in some amateur YouTube history video. Now, where do we start? Well, surely the best place to start would be the bare essentials. But what are the bare essentials? I guess the best place we could start is the 1933 Montevideo Convention, which is generally used as the minimum requirement for what can be regarded as a state. Of course, a permanent population is perhaps the key ingredient to a functioning and remotely recognisable state. You need a population big enough to build and maintain all of the little things needed to keep a society running these days, like roads, radio towers, railways, and other things that don't begin with R. Oftentimes, definitions and retellings of the Convention's requirements are mixed in with elements of the UN's Charter for Self-Determination. As such, another important tenet to statehood is your population having some connection to the land they're on, because generally invading other people's territories isn't a good look these days. But that part is never actually mentioned in the Convention, perhaps because there's no more dubious a place to start declaring your connection to the land than the Americas. Step 1. Have some people, keep them busy, and make sure they've lived there a while. While this one is generally placed as second to a permanent population, I feel as though this one is arguably the most important. After all, you can't exactly have a permanent population if you don't have a plot of land to even put them on. A defined territory can, in theory, be as big or as small as you want it to be. Take Taiwan, for example, an island country that until 2005 claimed an estimated 20 to 25% of the Asian continent as their own. Of course, pretty much everybody outside of the most ardent Taiwanese nationalists consider these claims as total bollocks, but I think that it's a testament to just how much a country can claim when it really wants to. Most countries stick to more modest claims, keeping to the lands that they have control over, maybe even claiming lands that they used to have control over or have a historical claim over, like the late Republic of Artsakh, which, before Azerbaijan so rudely removed it from the map halfway through me writing the script, claimed much of Azerbaijan as their own. Step 2. Claim where your people live, and don't bite off more than you can chew. For a state to be a state, it needs to have a government that can at least pretend to hold itself up. Technically, the only word that the Convention uses for this third requirement is government. No, really. So, good on you, Cornwall. You get a free pass on this one. Step 3. Have a government. If it works, great. If it doesn't, then For a state to be counted as a state, it needs to have the capacity to communicate and forge bonds with other states. Otherwise, One could make the argument that ant colonies could be classified as nation-states, and that just wouldn't do now, would it? I presume that this one is there to rule out all of those in the world that the New World states and their European friends considered less civilized than them, as I don't see how else one could interpret this section as anything other than the ability to write and sign and ratify treaties. This does, of course, mean that if your nation or tribe or other such group doesn't have a writing system, LMAO, no statehood for you. Ugh. Step 4. Be able to write treaties and hope to God that someone on the other end can understand them. Now, how well does Cornwall fare in this game of geopolitical Lego? Surprisingly well, actually. The county of Cornwall has a population over 500,000 at time of writing, which in theory makes Cornwall as demographically viable as a nation as Montenegro, for better or for worse. Cornwall also has a rather notably defined territory, in fact, perhaps one of the most defined natural boundaries in all of England, with 2 rivers almost completely encasing the peninsula, with one at Leeds bus station to Leeds train stations walked between both of them. Cornwall Council already governs the entire county as a unified authority, so there would be no issues involving trying to tie together strings of local government. And finally, as an English-speaking county, I highly doubt the Cornish would have any problem signing treaties. But we both know there's more to being a country, isn't there? It's all well and good to proclaim yourself as a country, but you need to actually be able to foot the bill and keep it running. We've discussed the bricks you need to build a country. Now we need to talk about the mortar keeping it all glued together. After successfully passing all 4 prerequisites, our hypothetical Cornwall has finally achieved its independence from the United Kingdom. But we're not done yet. Breaking free is one thing, but staying free is another. For that to happen, there's a few more intricate things that we need to look at. Criteria such as, if a country wants to survive in the current world order, it has to have something it can provide to the global free market. Some countries, like Saudi Arabia, go with all reliable and export their natural resources to the rest of the world, whereas other countries not so blessed in resources, like Japan, export goods of a more manufactured nature. Smaller countries, generally lacking in both, resort to either converting themselves to a tax haven for seedy American businesses, or build a tourism economy. As England's resident holiday home hotspot, Cornwall is already in a good position to keep their already established tourism industry, and perhaps better open it up to the rest of the world. Maybe being less associated with their cold and rainy suzerain could be a benefit for those Cornish beaches. Yeah, I don't think Cornwall's getting out of this one. To keep your country afloat, you need a healthy working population of people between 18 and 50 to work the economy and take care of those too young or too old to work. Cornwall is not doing so great on this front. With a median population of, 47, meaning that over half the population is out of that ideal working age, if our hypothetical Cornish government doesn't invest in immigration, they'll likely witness a population implosion within the next 20 years. Above all else, a nation needs to believe itself to be a rightful nation before it can be a rightful nation. I mean, if the people of a nation don't care or don't see a reason to be independent, then what's the point of doing it at all? Does Cornwall have that independent mindset? Maybe. Don't get me wrong, the idea is certainly there. However, researching Cornwall and its inner workings shows a surprisingly different story. As mentioned last time, to the contrary of Celtic nationalists everywhere, the majority of Cornwall's population are generally fine with the UK. Autonomy would be nice, of course, but independence is a bit too far. Even if Cornwall broke free from the UK, would they be able to join any of the international organisations like the UN, EU and NATO? The UN? Yeah, very likely. So long as the UK is alright with it, they should have no problem. The EU and NATO are bigger problems though. While not entirely confirmed, during Scotland's bid for independence, there was a belief between many in the No campaign that Spain would block any attempts at a Scottish entry into the EU to stop Catalonia from getting any bright ideas. While such a claim is, these days, tenuous at best, there is, of course, the chance that such a thing could still happen, whether it be by a Spain terrified of its own independence movements, or some other seedy nation. Such a nation could, perhaps, even take advantage of Cornwall's perceived lesser significance compared to a nation like Scotland. Let's be honest, we're trying to craft a serious nation here. Well, kind of. Whatever the case, we want the international community to take our country as seriously as one can take an independent Cornish state. We've talked about Cornwall's entry into all the European Cool Kids clubs, but could it realistically get many nations around the world to agree with them that, yes, Cornwall is indeed an independent country, and not just some uppity region of the UK? Well, probably. Cornwall isn't exactly a hotly contested region, or a region with particularly any controversy surrounding it, so as long as the UK doesn't have any objections to its independence, it's the kind of case where world diplomats would just shrug and stamp the document as little more than a formality. So, after all of this dissection of Cornwall as a region and diving into things that make or break a state, through all of the prerequisites and all of the criteria needed to go places in the geopolitical world, could our fake nation-state even catch a glimpse of the freedom of the chains of the House of Windsor? Probably not. While Cornwall seems to have quite a bit going for itself in terms of natural resources and natural beauty, as well as what may very well be a pretty politically strategic position at the edge of the English Channel, there just doesn't really seem to be much of a will to do anything with it themselves. As mentioned before, despite what Cornish and Celtic nationalists will tell you, the average Cornishman is pretty fine with being part of the UK. Even still, we found the average Cornishman is probably too old or too entrenched in the current political status quo to even want to go out and protest in favour of independence. Hell, that Cornish man may very well not even still be around in 20 to 30 years' time due to just how old the average Cornishman is. Perhaps in the future, the people of Cornwall will be free from their shackles and will set sail on the political high seas to forge their own destiny, like the pirates of their very own Penzance. Maybe then will they finally be able to band together with their Celtic brothers and become the envy of every hopeless American with vague Celtic heritage online. Or maybe this is all bollocks, and you just watched a full documentary on a question you already knew the answer to. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Good night, folks. Thank you for watching. I'd like to give a special thanks to some of the early patrons, like Thomas O'Mearan, Tetra Lindenbaum, Theodore, and Joe Patterson.